The narrow path, choosing spirit over comfort and compromise. The narrow path has always been the symbol of divine discipline, a way of walking that demands faith over feelings and conviction over comfort. It is the road less traveled, the path of surrender, obedience, and spiritual endurance that leads to true life. In a world that constantly tempts the heart with compromise and comfort, following the narrow path requires courage that only the Spirit can sustain. This way is not meant to please the flesh, but to refine the soul. It is not a path of applause, but of transformation, where the soul is purified through daily choices that align the will of man with the will of God. Every believer faces this crossroad, to follow the broad road of comfort and acceptance, or to walk the narrow path where truth costs something, but eternity is gained. The journey on this path begins when one recognizes that faith is not a feeling, but an act of surrender. It is to choose spiritual integrity over momentary pleasure, to resist the call of the flesh that whispers of shortcuts and ease. Walking the narrow path means saying no to compromise when the world demands your conformity. It is about choosing what is right when everything around you celebrates what is wrong. The Spirit guides the faithful through valleys of testing, teaching that the comfort of this world is fleeting, but the peace that flows from obedience is eternal. This is the essence of walking by faith, not by sight. The commitment to choose spirit over comfort and compromise, the call to walk the narrow path. The call to walk the narrow path is not a gentle suggestion. It is a divine summons that echoes from eternity into the human heart. It is the voice of the Spirit calling the soul away from the illusions of the world and into the reality of God's kingdom. It is a call that demands separation, obedience, and surrender. It begins as a whisper, but for those who listen, it becomes a fire that can no longer be ignored. The narrow path is not for the curious, it is for the committed. It is for those who have seen through the emptiness of comfort and heard something deeper than their own desires, the holy pull of destiny. From the beginning of time, God has always called his people to walk a different road. Noah walked a lonely road when he built the ark amidst the laughter of the world. Abraham walked a road of uncertainty when he left everything familiar to follow a promise he could not see. Moses walked a narrow road through the wilderness, trusting God when logic offered no explanation. David walked it in caves, hunted yet chosen. Every saint, prophet, and disciple who ever carried the flame of God's presence knew this truth. The narrow path always costs something. It will ask you to leave behind what others hold dear. It will require you to walk away from crowds, applause, and sometimes even comfort itself. It will strip you of your illusions until only faith remains. The wide road, on the other hand, offers ease. It asks for nothing, but promises everything. It is filled with laughter, noise, and movement, yet it leads to emptiness. The narrow path, by contrast, looks difficult, lonely, and uncertain, but it leads to life. This paradox is at the heart of every spiritual journey. God's way often looks like loss to the world, yet it is gain to the soul. What appears restrictive is actually liberating. What feels like death to the flesh is resurrection for the spirit. The narrow path begins with a choice. Every believer must one day stand at the crossroads between comfort and calling, between the applause of men and the approval of God. Many hear the invitation, but few respond because they sense what it will cost. The flesh resists anything that threatens its comfort. The mind hesitates at anything that cannot be fully understood. But faith begins where understanding ends. The narrow path can only be entered by those who are willing to walk by faith and not by sight. When Jesus invited his followers to walk this path, he made it clear that it was not an easy one. "If anyone would come after me," he said, "let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me." To deny oneself is to silence the constant voice of the flesh, the voice that demands ease, pleasure, and recognition. To take up the cross is to accept death to everything that stands between you and obedience. To follow him is to walk into the unknown, trusting that every step, though painful, is purposeful. This is the narrow way. It is not a physical path, but a spiritual journey that begins in the heart and transforms the entire life. To walk this path is to declare war against compromise. It is to say, I will no longer live according to what feels good, but according to what is right. It means living with a sense of divine accountability, where your choices are no longer governed by emotion, but by conviction. Every step on this path is an act of resistance against the corruption of the world. It is an act of defiance against the flesh, which seeks to drag the soul back into darkness. It is an act of worship to the one who called you out of that darkness into his marvelous light. The narrow path cannot be walked with divided loyalty. You cannot keep one foot on the broad road and the other on the way of truth. The Spirit demands your whole heart. Half surrender is still rebellion. The narrow path is not about partial obedience, it is about absolute devotion. This is why it is so difficult. The Spirit will not share his throne with the flesh. To walk this road is to give up control, to abandon the illusion that you can lead yourself. It is to trust when you cannot trace, to obey when you do not understand, to praise when nothing feels good, to keep moving when fear screams for you to stop. The narrow path is often lonely because few will understand it. The world cannot comprehend why you would choose to suffer when you could avoid pain, why you would forgive when you could retaliate, why you would give when you could take. But those who walk by the Spirit know that obedience is its own reward. They know that the peace of God is worth more than the approval of men. They understand that the smile of heaven is worth more than the applause of earth. The flesh sees only the moment, but the Spirit sees eternity. The narrow path trains your eyes to look beyond what is visible. It teaches you that every trial has a purpose, and every sacrifice is seed for something eternal. When you refuse to bow to comfort, you grow in strength. When you endure rejection for righteousness, you gain wisdom. When you walk in obedience despite fear, you build unshakable faith. These invisible rewards far outweigh the temporary pleasures of the broad road. But to begin this walk, something inside must die. The ego must die. Pride must die. The craving for human validation must die. The obsession with control must die. Only when these false gods fall can the Spirit reign freely. God will not compete for space in a divided heart. The narrow path begins where the self ends. You cannot walk it carrying the baggage of past idols or the weight of uncrucified desire. Every step forward requires surrender. Every breath becomes an act of dependence. Every day becomes a prayer, not my will, but yours. Many fear the narrow path because it looks restrictive, but in truth, it is the only place where the soul is free. Sin disguises itself as freedom, but enslaves the heart with invisible chains. The narrow path looks narrow because it has boundaries, but those boundaries are the fences of divine protection. They keep the soul from wandering into destruction. God's commandments are not cages, they are guardrails, keeping you from falling into ruin. The broad road has no guardrails. It celebrates your freedom while leading you toward collapse. The narrow road teaches you discipline, but that discipline gives you peace. The narrow path is also the path of refinement. As you walk it, the Spirit will expose what still belongs to the flesh. He will reveal hidden motives, unhealed wounds, and secret fears, not to shame you, but to heal you. God's refining fire burns not to destroy, but to purify. It removes the dross of pride so that the gold of faith can shine. Every time you surrender, every time you obey in difficulty, you are being shaped into something eternal. The narrow path does not just change your direction, it changes your nature. There will be moments when you look around and see others walking in ease while your road feels steep. You will see people compromising and yet prospering, lying and yet succeeding, avoiding God's discipline and yet smiling. And you will wonder if the narrow path is worth it. But then the Spirit reminds you that appearances deceive. The broad road always looks appealing until it ends. The narrow path always looks painful until it rewards. God does not measure success by speed or comfort. He measures it by endurance and obedience. The prize is not given to those who start well, but to those who finish faithful. Every person who chooses the narrow path must learn to walk in silence with God. There will be seasons when His presence feels distant, when prayers seem unanswered, when you cannot see the fruit of your faith. These are not signs of abandonment, but of maturity. The Spirit withdraws the comfort of feeling to teach you the stability of faith. When you can walk without seeing, trust without understanding, and praise without feeling, then you have learned to walk the narrow way. The narrow path will test your relationships. Some will not understand your transformation, others will resist it. Some will call you extreme, others will call you foolish. But this path was never meant to be crowded. It is the path of separation, the road of refinement. God will prune your circle so that He can purify your purpose. He will remove people who drain your focus, environments that weaken your faith, and habits that hinder your growth. At first it will hurt, but later you will understand that He was not taking from you, He was protecting you. Walking the narrow path also means learning to live unseen. The Spirit teaches you to do good without recognition, to pray without announcement, to give without expectation, to serve without reward. The world thrives on visibility. The Spirit values invisibility. The hidden life is where true power is born. The narrow path is not about performing holiness, but about becoming holy in the quiet places where no one is watching. That is where the Spirit shapes character and prepares vessels that can carry His presence. As you continue, you will discover that the narrow path is not only about denial, it is also about delight. The more you surrender, the more peace you find. The more you obey, the lighter you become. The narrow road may strip you of many things, but it gives you what the world can never provide: rest for your soul. You stop striving to prove your worth. You stop chasing fleeting happiness. You learn that the only true joy is intimacy with God. You realize that obedience is not loss, but love. To walk the narrow path is to rediscover your original purpose. Humanity was never created for comfort. We were created for communion. Comfort is temporary. Communion is eternal. When Adam walked with God in the garden, he needed no riches, fame, or entertainment, only the presence of his Creator. The narrow path restores that communion. It teaches you to depend on God the way a child depends on their father. It rebuilds trust where fear once lived. It replaces anxiety with assurance. It reminds you that you were never meant to walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. The narrow path is not about perfection, it is about persistence. Even when you stumble, the Spirit helps you rise. Even when you doubt, He reminds you of truth. Even when your faith feels small, He carries you forward. The journey is not about how perfectly you walk, but about how faithfully you return every time you fall. Grace is the hand that keeps you on the path when weakness tries to pull you away. The deeper you go, the more you realize that this path is not just about personal salvation, but about spiritual transformation that touches others. Every step of obedience becomes a testimony to those watching. Your endurance becomes an encouragement. Your integrity becomes a light. Your peace becomes a sermon. Without words, your life begins to reveal the beauty of the Spirit. The narrow path is contagious. It inspires others to leave the broad road behind and follow the voice of truth. There will come a day when the journey ends and every step of faith will make sense. You will see how every trial was training, every delay was direction, every loss was love in disguise. The narrow path does not make sense while you are walking it, but in eternity, you will look back and understand that every tear watered the seeds of glory. The Spirit's way was never about making life easy, but about making you eternal. Those who walk this path will one day hear the words that every soul longs for. Well done, good and faithful servant. Those words are the reward of the narrow way. They are the echo of a life that refused compromise, that chose obedience over comfort, faith over fear, surrender over self. And on that day, you will realize that nothing you sacrificed was ever truly lost. Everything you gave up for God was an offering, and every offering was turned into eternal treasure. The narrow path is not a road you walk once, it is a lifestyle of daily surrender. Each day you wake up and decide again to crucify the flesh, to silence fear, to choose truth, to forgive, to trust, to obey. It is a continual yes to God. It is a rhythm of dying and rising, losing and gaining, falling and being lifted again. It is the sacred dance of transformation where grace leads and faith follows. And though the world may never understand it, the narrow path is the secret to true freedom. It is the road that leads home. It is the bridge between what is temporary and what is eternal. It is the proof that the Spirit still leads men and women out of darkness into marvelous light. It is the evidence that the kingdom of God still reigns in human hearts. Those who choose this way become living testimonies of God's faithfulness, pilgrims walking through a fallen world, carrying eternity within them. If you have heard that quiet whisper in your soul calling you higher, do not ignore it. That is the voice of the Spirit inviting you into the narrow path. It may cost you, but it will complete you. It may break you, but it will bless you. It will strip away everything that is false until only truth remains. And when you look back, you will know it was worth it. Every tear, every trial, every moment of surrender will have led you closer to the heart of God. If this message touched your heart, subscribe to the channel so that we can continue walking this narrow path together, learning, growing, and choosing the Spirit over comfort, over compromise, and over the desires of the flesh. This is the way that leads to life, and only those who endure will truly find it. The war between spirit and comfort. The war between the spirit and comfort is the most subtle and destructive battle in the life of a believer. It does not always come through visible temptations or open rebellion against God. More often, it comes dressed as peace, convenience, or harmless relaxation. Comfort seems innocent at first. It whispers, "You deserve to rest. You've done enough." Or, "You don't need to go that far." But comfort, when placed above obedience, becomes the enemy of the spirit. It lulls the soul into spiritual sleep, and in that sleep, faith begins to fade. The narrow path requires a constant awakening, a daily choice to live beyond what feels easy and step into what requires faith. The human heart naturally seeks comfort because the flesh fears pain, rejection, and uncertainty. Yet spiritual growth never happens in comfort zones. The Spirit thrives in obedience, not in ease. God does not build strong souls in peaceful gardens, but in deserts where dependence on Him is the only source of strength. Abraham left his home without knowing where he was going. Moses faced Pharaoh with trembling hands. David fled into caves before sitting on a throne. Jesus himself walked through hunger, rejection, and suffering. Every great act of divine purpose was born from discomfort, not luxury. The Spirit does not lead us toward what feels good, but toward what makes us good. Comfort becomes a snare when it blinds us to the urgency of our calling. The believer who prioritizes comfort over calling slowly begins to justify spiritual laziness. Prayer becomes optional. The word becomes secondary. Fellowship turns into routine. Fasting feels unnecessary. And before long, the fire that once burned for God turns into a flickering ember of religious habit. The devil rarely steals faith through force. He suffocates it through comfort. He knows that if he can make a believer love ease more than sacrifice, the Spirit's voice will be drowned by the noise of self-preservation. The enemy doesn't always want you to fall. Sometimes he just wants you to sit down and stop walking. The narrow path exposes every layer of false peace that comfort provides. It asks the soul hard questions. Are you walking with God, or are you walking with convenience? Are you choosing what the Spirit desires, or what your flesh craves? Each decision reveals your allegiance. The narrow path demands a sacred discomfort, a willingness to leave behind what feels good in exchange for what brings holiness. This is not self-punishment, but purification. God allows trials not to harm us, but to awaken us. Every discomfort is a divine chisel, shaping us into the image of Christ. Without the pressure of challenge, faith remains weak, like a muscle that is never tested. When comfort rules, compromise follows. The believer begins to trade conviction for acceptance, truth for popularity, holiness for pleasure. The voice of the Spirit becomes quieter because comfort silences conviction. The more one feeds the flesh, the less sensitive the soul becomes to the Spirit. It is a gradual erosion of spiritual power. This is why Jesus warned that the narrow path is difficult. It requires continual dying to self. To walk this path is to say, "Not my will, but yours." It means refusing shortcuts that promise joy without obedience, blessings without surrender, and crowns without crosses. The Spirit constantly invites us into holy discomfort, the kind that purifies, disciplines, and deepens dependence on God. This discomfort might come through rejection, loss, or solitude. Sometimes it comes through the absence of answers, when prayers seem delayed and faith feels heavy. But it is in those moments that the Spirit whispers, "Keep walking." The believer learns that divine comfort is not the absence of suffering, but the presence of peace in suffering. It is the awareness that God is with you in the fire, not necessarily removing the flames, but refining the heart. True comfort does not come from avoiding hardship. It comes from trusting that every hardship holds a purpose. The Spirit's comfort is eternal. It strengthens the soul even when the body is weary. The world's comfort is temporary. It soothes the flesh, but leaves the soul empty. When a believer learns to distinguish between the two, they begin to grow spiritually mature. The narrow path transforms the understanding of comfort. It teaches that the safest place in the universe is not the easiest path, but the one that keeps you closest to God. This inner war between spirit and comfort manifests in small daily moments. When you feel the urge to sleep instead of pray, comfort is speaking. When fear of rejection keeps you silent about your faith, comfort is leading. When forgiveness feels too difficult, when fasting seems unnecessary, when obedience costs too much, comfort stands at the door, offering ease while the Spirit calls you to sacrifice. Every time you choose obedience over ease, you strengthen the Spirit within. Every time you surrender convenience for conviction, your soul gains eternal weight. The Spirit is patient but persistent. He will not force the believer to choose holiness, but he will continually whisper truth. The challenge is not in hearing his voice, it's in silencing the noise of comfort long enough to obey. The modern believer faces perhaps the most deceptive form of comfort. Distraction, technology, entertainment, abundance, and self-focus have turned many hearts away from the narrow path. We live in a culture that glorifies pleasure and labels discipline as oppression, but the Spirit calls us to remember that temporary pleasure often leads to eternal poverty, while temporary discipline leads to eternal reward. The flesh desires a life without resistance, but resistance is the very environment where the Spirit grows. Paul wrote that suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope. There is no shortcut to spiritual maturity. To walk with God is to wrestle with comfort and continually choose surrender. Every time the believer says yes to the Spirit, a part of the old self dies. The narrow path is therefore not a single decision, but a lifetime of decisions that align the soul with heaven's will. Comfort also tempts through complacency, the illusion that I'm doing enough. But spiritual growth has no finish line on earth. As long as breath remains, the Spirit calls the believer to deeper surrender, greater love, and higher obedience. Complacency is the quiet death of spiritual vitality. It convinces the believer to settle for a shallow relationship with God, mistaking religious activity for intimacy. The narrow path confronts this illusion. It teaches that true devotion is not measured by how much you do for God, but by how much of yourself you give to Him. The Spirit often disrupts comfort to realign purpose. When life feels shaken, when plans collapse, when familiar things fade away, it might not be punishment but pruning. God removes what the flesh clings to so that the Spirit can grow freely. Every storm, every loss, every disappointment is an opportunity to prove that faith is not built on comfort but on Christ. This is the essence of the narrow path, to walk through pain and still trust, to face rejection and still love, to be misunderstood and still obey. Comfort promises safety, but it leads to stagnation. The Spirit promises transformation, but it requires surrender. These two masters cannot coexist in one heart. The believer must choose daily whom they will serve. Will it be the comfort of fleshly ease or the call of divine purpose? This is not a question answered once in a lifetime, but every day, in every decision, in every thought. The narrow path is paved with 1,000 small obediences that no one sees, but heaven records each one. Walking this path transforms suffering into sanctification. The believer learns to see discomfort not as punishment, but as preparation. When you deny comfort for the sake of obedience, you build spiritual authority. God can trust a soul that refuses compromise. He can fill a vessel that is emptied of pride, pleasure, and self-will. The world may see such a life as restrictive, but in truth, it is the only life that leads to freedom. The more you die to comfort, the more you live in peace. The Holy Spirit does not demand perfection. He desires surrender. He knows how fragile the human heart is, how tempting comfort can be. But he also knows that real peace cannot be found where the flesh rules. The Spirit gently teaches that every cross carried willingly becomes a crown in eternity. Every comfort sacrificed for righteousness becomes a testimony of faith. Every step on the narrow path echoes through eternity as an act of love toward the one who first chose the cross over comfort. The battle between spirit and comfort is therefore the battleground of purpose. The soul that wins this war becomes unshakable, not because life is easy, but because faith has become unbreakable. The believer learns that there is a deeper rest than sleep, a greater joy than pleasure, a higher satisfaction than success. It is the peace of knowing that your life is aligned with the will of God. The narrow path is not about suffering for suffering's sake. It is about transformation. The Spirit strips away every false comfort until only one truth remains, that your greatest comfort is His presence, and your greatest peace is obedience. When you understand this, you stop fearing discomfort. You begin to see trials as invitations to deeper intimacy. You stop chasing what fades and start clinging to what lasts. The narrow path becomes not a burden, but a blessing. It is the path where you lose everything that doesn't matter and gain everything that does. It is where the Spirit replaces fear with faith, weakness with strength, and compromise with courage. The Spirit's power is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of surrender. When the believer chooses obedience in the midst of hardship, heaven rejoices. That choice, invisible to the world, shakes the spiritual realm. It declares that your faith is real. Comfort will always try to negotiate with your calling. It will whisper that obedience can wait, that holiness can bend, that truth can be softened, but the Spirit calls you to stand firm, to choose purity over popularity, prayer over pleasure, and truth over comfort. The narrow path demands everything, but it gives more than it takes. The Spirit does not lead you through discomfort to destroy you, but to reveal the strength you didn't know you had. Each time you resist the pull of comfort, you grow closer to the likeness of Christ, the one who embraced suffering to redeem you. The more you walk this path, the clearer you see that comfort is an illusion and that peace is a person. So choose the narrow way. Choose spirit over comfort. Choose faith over feelings. Choose obedience over ease. Because one day, when the race is finished and the faith is kept, the crown prepared for those who endured will shine brighter than every comfort this world ever offered. The narrow path is the hardest road, but it is also the only road that leads home. If this message has touched your spirit, remember to subscribe to the channel so you can continue walking with us in faith, strength, and truth as we explore more revelations that awaken your soul and keep you steadfast on the narrow path. The cost of choosing spirit over compromise. To choose the Spirit over compromise is to declare war on everything in this world that promises you an easier life at the price of your integrity. Compromise is the language of the flesh. It's the art of lowering the standard just enough to stay comfortable while still appearing faithful. It's subtle, seductive, and deadly because it convinces you that you can serve two masters without consequence. Yet Jesus was clear. No one can serve two masters. You will love one and despise the other. The path of the Spirit is absolute. It leaves no space for divided loyalty. Every believer must come to the point where the line between the narrow path and the broad road becomes visible. Compromise begins where conviction ends. It starts small, with silence when truth should be spoken, with tolerance where holiness should stand firm. It creeps in through the desire to please others, to fit in, to be accepted. The enemy knows he cannot always tempt a believer with sin directly, so he offers diluted obedience. He whispers, "You don't need to go that far," or "God understands," or "just once won't matter." But every small compromise is a seed of disobedience that grows into bondage. To choose spirit over compromise is not a one-time act, but a daily crucifixion of the flesh. The Spirit leads us into truth, and truth is often uncomfortable. The world despises those who refuse to conform because obedience exposes compromise. A believer filled with the Spirit becomes a mirror to those still living in deception. Their light exposes the shadows in others' hearts. This is why walking the narrow path often brings loneliness. When you choose the Spirit, you may lose friends, opportunities, or the approval of others. But you gain peace with God, and that peace outweighs every earthly loss. Compromise promises acceptance but robs the soul of authority. A compromised believer loses power in prayer because hypocrisy weakens spiritual credibility. You cannot rebuke darkness while secretly entertaining it. You cannot command mountains to move if your heart is divided between faith and fear. The Spirit flows through purity. Purity is not perfection, it's undivided devotion. It is to say, "God, you alone will have my loyalty, even when obedience costs me comfort, success, or understanding." When Daniel refused to eat the king's food, it was not about diet, it was about devotion. When he prayed, though it was forbidden, it was not rebellion, it was allegiance to the higher kingdom. When his friends refused to bow to the statue, they were not trying to make a statement. They were protecting the integrity of their worship. Each of them could have compromised and lived comfortably, but they chose the Spirit over survival. And in every case, God honored their courage. The same truth holds today. When you refuse compromise, you open the door for God's glory to manifest through your life. The Spirit always calls you to higher ground, while the flesh invites you to settle. Compromise always feels reasonable. It tells you to adjust truth to circumstances, but truth cannot be adjusted without losing its nature. The Spirit of God never negotiates with darkness. He does not bend to comfort culture or moral gray zones. He is holy, and those who follow him must walk in holiness. This doesn't mean walking in pride or self-righteousness. It means allowing God to purify every motive until obedience becomes an act of love, not obligation. Many believers today live torn between conviction and convenience. They want the blessings of the narrow path, but the pleasures of the broad one. They quote scripture but compromise in secret. They raise their hands in worship but lower their standards in temptation. Yet God cannot bless what he cannot inhabit, and he does not inhabit divided hearts. The narrow path requires a complete surrender of will, because the Spirit cannot coexist with compromise. It is a fire that consumes impurity, not a gentle breeze that tolerates it. Choosing Spirit over compromise also means accepting that truth will often make you misunderstood. The world calls intolerance what heaven calls holiness. When you refuse to lie, cheat, or bend to corruption, you will stand out, and standing out in a world that worships conformity is costly. But it is precisely in that cost that the Spirit's strength is revealed. God gives his deepest anointing to those who will not sell their souls for applause. Every prophet, every disciple, every saint who walked the narrow road bore the marks of obedience on their hearts. They lived for an audience of one. To live without compromise is to live with spiritual clarity. Compromise clouds discernment. It makes you justify what you once condemned. It numbs your conscience, turning conviction into irritation. But when you walk by the Spirit, conviction becomes your compass. The Spirit will whisper when you're about to take a wrong step. He will disturb your peace when you drift from alignment. The cost of choosing Spirit over compromise is not merely external persecution, it is internal purification. God will confront you, test you, and prune you until the old habits, hidden motives, and false dependencies are burned away. The narrow path is not comfortable because transformation never is. The Spirit dismantles every false identity built on compromise. He will strip away relationships that weaken your conviction, habits that dull your faith, and opportunities that tempt you away from holiness. It hurts, but it heals. The fire of the Spirit purifies not to destroy, but to refine. Each time you say no to compromise, the Spirit says yes to your calling. Choosing the Spirit also means rejecting the world's definition of success. Compromise often comes disguised as opportunity. You may be offered influence, wealth, or favor if you just bend a little. But the Spirit whispers, "Do not trade eternal purpose for temporary gain." The world measures success by how much you gain. Heaven measures it by how much you surrender. When Jesus faced the temptation in the wilderness, Satan offered him kingdoms, glory, and power. Yet Jesus chose obedience over ambition. His refusal to compromise in private qualified him for victory in public. Likewise, the private victories you win against compromise determine the public authority you carry in the Spirit. Every act of obedience becomes a declaration that you belong fully to God. It breaks unseen chains and establishes spiritual authority. Compromise, on the other hand, gives the enemy a foothold. The smallest act of disobedience opens a door for spiritual decay. This is why Scripture warns that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. The believer must guard their integrity fiercely. The enemy doesn't need your total surrender. He only needs a small opening. He knows that if he can make you justify one lie, one hidden sin, one moment of moral flexibility, he can erode your strength over time. The Spirit calls you to close every door through repentance and to walk in transparency before God. Choosing Spirit over compromise means embracing truth, even when it exposes your flaws. The Spirit convicts not to shame, but to cleanse. He does not condemn the believer, he refines them. Conviction is the mercy of God. It is his way of rescuing you before sin hardens your heart. A life led by the Spirit remains teachable, humble, and willing to change. Compromise resists correction, but the Spirit welcomes it. Every time you humble yourself before God, he restores your sensitivity to his voice. Compromise thrives in secrecy. The Spirit thrives in light. Bring everything into the open before God, your temptations, your fears, your doubts, and he will give you strength to overcome them. When you hide, darkness grows stronger, but when you expose your struggles to the light, their power dies. The narrow path requires vulnerability, because intimacy with God is built on honesty. The Spirit cannot bless the version of you that pretends to be faithful while secretly feeding the flesh. He blesses the real you, the one who confesses, repents, and depends. There is also a cost of isolation when you choose Spirit over compromise. The world's systems will reject you because you no longer play by their rules. You will lose invitations, recognition, or relationships. But that rejection is divine protection. God removes what cannot walk with your purpose. You are not meant to be liked by everyone. You are meant to reflect Christ. And Christ himself was despised and rejected. Yet in his rejection, salvation was born. In your own rejection, transformation begins. The more you choose Spirit over compromise, the more you realize that obedience is not bondage, it is freedom. Sin promises freedom, but leads to slavery. Obedience feels restrictive, but leads to peace. The narrow path liberates the soul from the tyranny of pleasing people, from the anxiety of fitting in, and from the corruption of divided allegiance. You begin to live for eternal applause, not earthly approval. You begin to experience joy that no comfort can imitate, and strength that no compromise can provide. The Holy Spirit empowers you to walk this path, not by your strength, but by his grace. Every time you feel weak, he reminds you that his power is made perfect in weakness. When temptation rises, he provides a way out. When you fall, he offers restoration. The battle against compromise is not fought by willpower, but by surrender. When you yield fully to the Spirit, he fills the spaces that compromise once occupied. In a world that bends truth for convenience, your faithfulness becomes prophetic. When you stand firm in holiness, your life speaks louder than words. You become a testimony that integrity still matters, that purity still has power, that God still honors those who refuse to bow. The narrow path is not a lonely road. It is a sacred one, walked by saints and strengthened by the Spirit. Every step away from compromise is a step toward divine intimacy. In the end, choosing Spirit over compromise defines your destiny. The broad road is full of noise, crowds, and comfort, but it leads to emptiness. The narrow path may be steep and solitary, but it leads to glory. Every sacrifice made for truth becomes treasure in eternity. Every no spoken to sin becomes a yes to purpose. The Spirit rewards obedience not with fleeting pleasure, but with lasting peace. To follow the narrow path is to echo Christ's prayer in Gethsemane, "Not my will, but yours be done." And it is to trust that every cost will be repaid with eternal joy. The narrow path may wound your pride, strip your comfort, and expose your weakness, but it also refines your soul, strengthens your faith, and deepens your communion with God. The Spirit's path is not the easiest road, but it is the only one that leads to life. If this message stirred your heart, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Continue walking this narrow path with us as we seek truth, reject compromise, and live daily by the power of the Spirit who transforms every trial into triumph. The refining fire. When the Spirit purifies through trials. Every soul that chooses the narrow path must sooner or later pass through the refining fire. It is not a punishment, but a process, a divine furnace where impurities are burned away and true faith is revealed. When you choose the Spirit over comfort and compromise, God begins a deeper work within you. He tests not to destroy you, but to strengthen you, not to shame you, but to shape you. The refining fire is the classroom of the Spirit. It teaches you dependence, humility, and endurance. It is in that fire that your faith ceases to be theory and becomes reality. Words are easy on the mountain, but conviction is proven in the valley. Every believer prays for the Spirit's power, but few understand that power is always preceded by purification. Before gold can shine, it must pass through heat. Before a vessel can carry divine oil, it must be cleansed of residue. The same is true for the soul. God will not pour His glory into a heart that still clings to pride, fear, or hidden compromise. So, He allows seasons of fire, periods when everything familiar seems stripped away. Friendships fade, finances crumble, opportunities vanish, prayers seem unanswered. It feels as though heaven has gone silent. But silence is never absence. It is strategy. God does His deepest work in hidden seasons. When you walk through trials, you discover the difference between knowing about God and knowing Him personally. The fire burns away false religion and shallow belief. It exposes motives. It forces you to confront whether your obedience was built on reward or on love. Many people follow God as long as blessings flow. But when the fire comes, their devotion cools. Yet those who are truly surrendered understand that faith is not measured by what God gives, but by who He remains when everything else is taken away. The Spirit's refining fire reveals whether your roots go deep. In the absence of comfort, you are forced to draw from the well of divine presence. In the loss of human approval, you learn to hear God's voice more clearly. In the death of old dreams, new vision is born. The narrow path is a path of transformation, not transaction. God is not interested in what you can do for Him. He is interested in who you are becoming in Him. The trial, therefore, is not about punishment but purification. The fire exposes attachments that have no place in your destiny. You may lose relationships that once felt essential, but in truth, they were distractions. You may be stripped of status or success, but those were weights keeping you from running freely. The fire burns away idols, the subtle loves that compete with your love for God. It reveals whether your faith was built on feeling or on foundation. When everything you relied on is gone, and yet you still worship, that is when heaven takes notice. That is when faith becomes pure gold. The Spirit never wastes pain. Every hardship becomes a tool in His hand. He allows trials to train your discernment, to refine your patience, and to develop your endurance. In comfort, the believer learns little. In hardship, he learns who God truly is. The fire is where you discover that grace is not a concept, but a force that carries you when strength is gone. It's where you realize that peace is not the absence of storms, but the presence of Christ within them. When God refines, He does not destroy. The fire is precise. It targets what must die, but preserves what must live. Think of how silver is refined. The silversmith heats it until impurities rise to the surface, then skims them away, repeating the process until he can see his reflection in the metal. Likewise, God keeps you in the fire until His image is formed in you. Every trial you endure is His reflection being restored. Every moment you choose faith instead of fear, you become more like Him. The refining fire is not meant to be escaped, but embraced. Most believers pray for deliverance when they should pray for endurance. The Spirit does not rush the process because eternal character cannot be built in haste. Every great soul in Scripture walked through the furnace. Joseph was betrayed and imprisoned before he ruled. Moses wandered 40 years before he led. David was hunted before he reigned. Even Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness before beginning his ministry. The path of preparation is always paved with trials. In the fire, you learn to let go of control. You realize that your plans, no matter how noble, cannot substitute divine purpose. The Spirit teaches surrender not as a one-time act, but as a rhythm of life. Each flame you pass through reveals a new layer of trust. You stop trying to understand and start learning to believe. You stop asking, "Why me?" and begin saying, "Use me." That shift marks the beginning of maturity. The narrow path is filled with refining seasons, precisely because God intends to use those who walk it. He cannot entrust great authority to untested character. The fire ensures that when you are elevated, pride does not destroy you. It breaks your dependence on applause and recognition. You learn to serve from humility rather than ambition, to obey from love rather than obligation. You become anchored in conviction instead of convenience. One of the hardest truths about refinement is that God often uses people and circumstances to ignite it. The betrayal of Judas was the fire that revealed Christ's endurance. The jealousy of Saul was the fire that shaped David's humility. The cruelty of Pharaoh was the fire that awakened Moses' leadership. The opposition you face is not always demonic, it is often divine. God uses adversity as an instrument of advancement. Every obstacle becomes an altar where your trust in Him deepens. The flesh resists this process. It cries for escape, for relief, for explanation. But the Spirit whispers, "Stay," because in the staying, transformation occurs. When you endure without bitterness, when you forgive while still wounded, when you praise through tears, that is worship in its highest form. The angels understand worship through perfection. Humans reveal it through pain. Nothing moves heaven more than a believer who refuses to bow to despair. The refining fire also reveals hidden strength. The believer who survives one trial becomes equipped for the next. Each victory adds weight to your spiritual authority. You begin to realize that the fire that once threatened to destroy you has instead empowered you. You stop fearing trials because you recognize them as divine invitations to greater intimacy. The same flame that burns away impurity also illuminates the path ahead. In the midst of fire, the Spirit's presence becomes tangible. The very thing meant to consume you becomes the place where you encounter God most deeply. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego discovered that truth firsthand. When thrown into the furnace, the flames did not burn them, they purified their faith. And there, in the middle of the fire, they met the one who looked like the Son of God. Sometimes you will never see Christ so clearly as in the moments when everything else is stripped away. The furnace becomes holy ground. The refining process also changes your desires. What once attracted you no longer holds power. You stop craving the applause of men because you have tasted the approval of heaven. You stop chasing worldly comfort because you have found peace that cannot be purchased. The fire recalibrates your heart toward eternity. You begin to measure success not by what you possess, but by what you've overcome. The narrow path and the refining fire are inseparable. To walk one is to experience the other. Every test reveals whether you trust God's timing, His will, and His goodness. Sometimes the fire lingers longer than expected, and in that waiting, faith is perfected. Waiting is one of God's most powerful refining tools. It teaches you that maturity is not about speed, but about depth. While you wait, He works. While you burn, He builds. It is also in the fire that you learn compassion. Those who have suffered become healers. Those who have been broken become bridges for others. Refinement teaches you empathy because it reminds you of your own weakness. You stop judging others and start interceding for them. You become a vessel through which the Spirit's mercy flows freely. God's purpose for the fire is never just about you. It's about what He will do through you afterward. The fire gives birth to ministry. When the refining is complete, the believer emerges different, not just stronger, but softer, humbler, more aware of grace. The same heart that once sought answers now seeks His presence. You no longer need to understand everything because you've learned that God is faithful even when nothing makes sense. The fire turns theology into intimacy. You stop quoting verses about faith and start living them. But refinement is not a one-time event. Life brings cycles of fire, new seasons where God deepens your character and expands your capacity. Each time, the flames feel familiar yet different. They come not to destroy, but to advance. You begin to recognize the fire as a friend rather than an enemy. You realize that without it, your soul would grow cold. The Spirit walks with you through every season of testing. He is the unseen companion in every furnace, the voice that reminds you of purpose when pain screams louder. He says, "Do not be afraid. I'm with you in the fire." Those words carry eternal weight. When you realize that God is not watching from afar, but walking beside you, fear loses its power. Choosing the narrow path means choosing refinement. It means allowing the Spirit to expose what cannot enter eternity with you. It means trusting that pain has a purpose, loss has a lesson, and fire has a finish line. The believer who endures refinement emerges unrecognizable, not because they've lost something, but because they've found someone. When the fire passes, what remains is not ashes, but authenticity. You no longer live for appearance or applause. You live from the presence. The world sees endurance. Heaven sees transformation. The narrow path, though filled with trials, becomes the road to unshakable joy. Because after the fire, you realize nothing can be taken from you that truly matters. To be refined by the Spirit is to be trusted by God. He refines only those He intends to use. The greater the calling, the deeper the fire. But remember, every flame you endure today becomes light for others tomorrow. The narrow path of fire leads not to destruction, but to distinction. It separates those who talk about faith from those who live it. If you are in the fire now, hold on. Do not curse the process. The Spirit is not absent. He is working in silence. The same God who allowed the heat controls its limit. You will not be burned beyond what you can bear. And when the fire ends, you will emerge as gold, tested, proven, and radiant. The refining fire is proof of divine love. God disciplines those He loves. He prunes so that fruit may grow. He purifies so that purpose may flourish. When you understand this, your tears become worship, your trials become testimony, and your scars become symbols of grace. The narrow path leads through the fire, but it always ends in glory. If this message speaks to your heart, subscribe to the channel to continue walking this sacred journey of refinement, faith, and victory. Together, we will learn how every fire reveals the light of God and how every trial becomes a step closer to eternity. The reward of the narrow path. The Spirit's eternal victory over the flesh. There comes a moment in every believer's journey when they look back at the road they have walked, the pain, the tests, the sacrifices, the silent nights, and realize that the narrow path, though filled with thorns, was the only one that led to real peace. The flesh promised comfort, but gave emptiness. The world offered pleasure, but delivered chains. Yet the Spirit, though He led through valleys and fires, gave something that cannot be stolen: freedom. The reward of the narrow path is not merely awaiting in heaven, it begins now, in the deep transformation of the soul that has learned to live by the Spirit and not by sight. The reward of walking this path is intimacy with God, a communion so sacred that it changes the way you breathe, think, and move through the world. It is not found in material blessing or worldly success, but in the quiet assurance that you are known by the Creator of the universe. The flesh craves recognition. The Spirit gives revelation. The flesh seeks applause. The Spirit whispers identity. When you surrender your comfort, when you crucify your desires daily, when you refuse to compromise truth for convenience, something begins to happen inside you. You awaken to divine reality. The spirit within you starts to govern every thought and desire until obedience no longer feels like loss. It feels like home. The narrow path produces character, not just belief. Many profess faith, but few are transformed by it. The Spirit's work is not about making your life easier, it's about making your soul eternal. He teaches you that discipline is love, that pruning is protection, and that waiting is not punishment, but preparation. Through each battle, through each denial of the flesh, you are being reshaped into the likeness of Christ. That likeness is the ultimate reward, not crowns. Not thrones, not recognition, but the image of the Son reflected in your spirit. The flesh wants immediate satisfaction. The Spirit teaches eternal vision. Those who walk the narrow path begin to see beyond the moment. They understand that the true treasure is not what they can touch, but what they can become. Every temptation resisted, every tear sown in faith, every act of obedience unseen by men becomes a deposit in eternity. You may lose much in this life, friends, comfort, even reputation, but what you gain is unshakable peace. You gain a heart that cannot be bought, a mind that cannot be corrupted, and a spirit that cannot be defeated. Walking the narrow path also reveals that the Spirit's reward is endurance. You begin to live above circumstance. The storms still come, but they no longer move you. You no longer pray for storms to stop. You pray for strength to stand. You no longer ask God to make life easy. You ask Him to make your faith unbreakable. And He answers not by removing trials, but by increasing your resilience. You become steady in chaos, calm in conflict, patient in pain. The Spirit produces in you what the flesh never could: constancy. The believer who remains faithful to the narrow path discovers the deep mystery of joy in suffering. This joy is not laughter or excitement. It is the quiet certainty that everything has purpose. It's the confidence that nothing is wasted, not even your wounds. The Spirit turns your scars into testimonies. He turns your failures into wisdom. He redeems what the enemy meant for harm and uses it to reveal His strength through your weakness. That is the beauty of the narrow path. It transforms every loss into gain. The reward of the Spirit is also clarity. The longer you walk this path, the clearer you see the invisible hand of God guiding your steps. What once felt like delay, you now recognize as divine timing. What once felt like rejection, you now understand as redirection. The narrow path gives you eyes that see beyond appearances. You stop chasing what glitters because you've learned to recognize what's gold. The world's lights no longer blind you. The Spirit's flame within you becomes enough. There is a freedom that only those who die to the flesh experience, the freedom of no longer being controlled by desire, fear, or pride. When the Spirit reigns, you are no longer enslaved by opinion or circumstance. You begin to live from within, guided not by impulse, but by peace. You stop running after people to be understood because you realize that divine purpose does not require explanation. It requires faith. The narrow path liberates you from the need for validation. Your worth no longer fluctuates with others' perception, because your identity is anchored in the eternal. Those who remain faithful on the narrow path also receive the reward of discernment. The Spirit sharpens your perception, allowing you to sense deception before it touches you. He gives you wisdom to distinguish between opportunity and distraction, between emotion and direction. You become attuned to the frequency of heaven, sensitive to the whispers that guide the obedient. While the world stumbles in confusion, the Spirit-led believer walks in divine clarity. That clarity is one of the greatest treasures of the narrow way, but perhaps the most profound reward is transformation itself, the slow, steady conversion of the human heart into a vessel of divine love. The more you yield to the Spirit, the more love replaces fear. The more you die to self, the more compassion takes root. You begin to love even those who wounded you, not because they deserve it, but because the Spirit within you is incapable of hatred. Love becomes your nature, not your effort. That is the victory of the Spirit, to make a once selfish, anxious, fearful heart capable of loving like Christ. The world cannot understand such transformation. It looks at the believer walking the narrow path and sees loss, loneliness, or limitation. But heaven sees strength, wisdom, and purity. The Spirit's victory is invisible to those who measure life by comfort. They cannot understand the paradox that to die is to live, to lose is to gain, to surrender is to win. Yet every soul that has chosen the Spirit over the flesh knows this truth intimately. What you surrender in obedience returns multiplied as peace, purpose, and power. When you walk by the Spirit long enough, the battles that once terrified you become familiar ground. Temptation no longer surprises you. Pain no longer breaks you. You stop asking why and start saying, "What now, Lord?" That shift marks the maturity of the Spirit's work in you. It is the moment when you realize that nothing external can dictate your internal posture. You become unoffendable, unshaken, and undivided. The world still attacks, but the arrows cannot penetrate a heart anchored in obedience. There is also the reward of divine companionship. Those who live by the Spirit walk with God as their closest friend. His presence becomes constant, not only in prayer but in every breath. You feel him in silence, sense him in decisions, hear him in whispers. The relationship that once felt distant becomes a living dialogue. You no longer follow rules, you follow the voice. You no longer strive to earn his favor, you walk in the awareness that you already have it. This intimacy is what Adam lost in the garden and what Christ restored through the cross. To walk by the Spirit is to walk again with God in the cool of the day. The narrow path also grants authority, spiritual authority that cannot be manufactured or bought. Authority is born from obedience. Every time you say yes to God and no to the flesh, your authority grows. Heaven trusts those who refuse compromise. When you speak, the spiritual realm listens, not because of eloquence, but because your words carry the weight of submission. The Spirit anoints clean vessels. Authority is not a title, it's a testimony. It is the evidence that you have endured the cross and emerged transformed. The final reward, the eternal one, is the crown of life promised to those who endure. The narrow path leads to a gate that opens into glory, where every tear is remembered, every sacrifice recorded, every unseen act of obedience celebrated. The world may forget your name, but heaven never does. In eternity, the narrow path shines like gold because it was paved with surrender. Those who walked it find themselves face to face with the one they followed by faith. The greatest reward is not paradise. It is his presence. The narrow path leads straight to his heart. The Spirit's eternal victory over the flesh is the culmination of every small act of faithfulness. Each temptation resisted, each battle endured, each prayer whispered in exhaustion builds toward this victory. The flesh dies slowly, but the Spirit resurrects fully. This resurrection is not only a future event, it begins now. When you forgive instead of hate, the Spirit wins. When you serve instead of complain, the Spirit wins. When you trust instead of fear, the Spirit wins. Every time you choose truth over comfort, the Spirit's victory expands within you. The narrow path will never attract crowds because it is not a path of appearance but of authenticity. The Spirit is not impressed by performance. He is moved by surrender. Many will start on this road, but only those willing to die daily will finish. Yet those who finish will understand why few find it, because it demands everything, but gives everything in return. The broad road ends in emptiness, the narrow road ends in fullness. When the Spirit fully reigns in a person's life, even death loses its sting. Fear dissolves because you realize that eternity has already begun within you. The same power that raised Christ from the dead lives in you, not as a metaphor but as reality. You become a living testimony that heaven is not a destination, but a dimension of existence that begins when the Spirit governs your being. The narrow path, therefore, is not a route to somewhere else. It is the transformation of the soul into the likeness of the one who walked it first. There will be days when you stumble, when the flesh seems louder than the Spirit, when obedience feels like loss. But the Spirit never abandons those who walk this road. He picks you up, restores you, and strengthens you again. The narrow path is not for the perfect, but for the persistent. The only failure is to stop walking. As long as you rise again, the Spirit keeps refining, teaching, and empowering. The reward is also seen in the fruit your life bears for others. The narrow path does not only sanctify you, it becomes a light for those lost on the broad road. People around you begin to notice peace in your storms, forgiveness in your pain, faith in your waiting. They are drawn not to your strength, but to the Spirit shining through your weakness. Without preaching a word, your life becomes a sermon, the kind that cannot be refuted because it is lived, not spoken. The greatest evangelism is endurance. The narrow path turns ordinary believers into vessels of divine impact. God trusts those who have walked through fire because they know how to carry His glory without pride. They minister not from theory, but from scars. Their compassion is real, their wisdom tested, their love unconditional. These are the warriors of the Spirit, the ones who have overcome the flesh, not by might or by power, but by surrender. In the end, the reward of the narrow path is union. Flesh and Spirit no longer war, because the flesh has been crucified and the Spirit reigns completely. You live no longer for yourself, but for the one who died and rose for you. Your will aligns perfectly with His. Your heart beats in rhythm with eternity. You have become what God intended from the beginning, a living temple of His presence. That is the highest calling, the final victory, the eternal reward. So walk the narrow path with courage. When you are weary, remember that the Spirit is your strength. When you are lonely, remember that heaven watches your every step. When you are tempted, remember that your obedience echoes in eternity. The journey is long, but the destination is glorious. The Spirit's light guides each step, and though the road may grow darker around you, that light within you will never fade. The narrow path is the story of surrender, written in every believer's life. It begins with faith, continues through fire, and ends in glory. It is the path Jesus walked, the path of the apostles, the path of all who refuse to trade eternity for comfort. To walk it is to live crucified to the world and alive to God. And though the flesh may fight, the Spirit always triumphs. The Spirit's reward is Himself, His peace, His power, His presence, His eternity. To walk with Him is to discover that every step, every battle, every tear was leading you closer to the heart of the Father. The narrow path may be hard, but it is holy. It may wound, but it heals. It may strip, but it sanctifies. And when you finally reach the end, you will realize that the cost was nothing compared to the glory revealed. This is the final truth of the narrow path. It does not just change your destiny, it changes you. It takes the weak and makes them strong, the broken and makes them whole, the lost and makes them light. It turns ordinary lives into eternal legacies. And when you finally stand before the one who called you, you will not regret the road you took. You will see that every sacrifice was love in disguise, every hardship a seed of glory, every lonely step a dance with the divine. If this message has blessed your spirit, subscribe to the channel so that you can continue walking with us in faith, perseverance, and divine wisdom. Together we will keep choosing the narrow path, the path of the Spirit, the path of truth, the path that leads to everlasting life.